Section 1. The Crucifixion as a symbolic act. The crucifixion of Jesus Christ is one of the most dramatic and powerful events in human history. On the surface, it is a tale of suffering, pain, and ultimate sacrifice. But when viewed through an esoteric lens, the crucifixion takes on an entirely different meaning, one that resonates deeply with our own spiritual journey. At its core, the crucifixion symbolizes the soul's willingness to release its attachment to the material world and the ego. The cross is not just a physical structure, it is a symbol of the tension between the earthly realm and the divine realm. It is the point where the soul must transcend the limitations of the material body and embrace a higher consciousness. In esoteric thought, suffering is seen as a catalyst for transformation. The crucifixion represents a moment of extreme surrender, a moment where the ego dies and the soul is free to transcend. In this light, Jesus' suffering can be understood as a universal experience, a representation of every individual's struggle to let go of their lower self and rise to a higher state of being. Section 2. The Spiritual Significance of Death. Death in many spiritual traditions is not viewed as an end, but as a necessary passage. The resurrection that follows Jesus' death can be seen as a metaphor for the soul's journey through the darkness of ignorance and suffering toward the light of divine wisdom. Jesus' physical death is symbolic of the death of the ego, an ego that keeps us trapped in the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. When we identify only with our material selves, we are imprisoned by the confines of this world. But in death, the soul is freed from its attachment to the body, allowing it to enter a state of higher awareness. In esoteric traditions like Gnosticism and Hermeticism, death is often viewed as a step in the process of spiritual awakening. The soul must shed its earthly skin to be reborn in the higher realms of consciousness. The resurrection, then, is not just a physical event. It is the soul's return to its true divine nature. Section 3. The Resurrection, Symbol of Spiritual Rebirth. Now that we have explored the crucifixion as a powerful symbolic act of surrender, pain, and transformation, we come to the most sacred part of the story, the resurrection. The resurrection of Jesus is often seen as the ultimate victory over death, an affirmation of eternal life, and a promise of spiritual rebirth. However, when we move beyond the conventional understanding, we begin to see that resurrection represents something far more profound. In the spiritual realm, resurrection is not simply about coming back to life after physical death. It is the soul's ability to transcend the material world, to rise from the ashes of ego, suffering, and ignorance into the light of divine understanding. The resurrection is symbolic of the process of spiritual awakening, the soul's rebirth after it has undergone the transformative process of inner death. For the seeker, the resurrection is an initiation into a new state of being. It signifies the moment when the soul awakens from the slumber of materialism and begins to embrace its true divine nature. This is the moment when one can no longer be bound by the limitations of the flesh, but rather transcends into a state of pure spiritual consciousness. The resurrection of Jesus offers a powerful message that after suffering, after the death of the ego, after confronting the darkness within, there is a rebirth into higher awareness. This theme of resurrection is not exclusive to Christianity alone. It appears in many esoteric traditions. The idea of returning to divine unity, experiencing spiritual rebirth, and entering eternal life can be found in the ancient teachings of Hermeticism, Gnosticism, and even other world religions.
Section 4. Jesus as the archetype of the spiritual seeker. In the story of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, we see not just an individual journey, but an archetypal journey, a universal path that each of us must walk. Jesus embodies the spiritual seeker, the initiate who travels from darkness to light, from ignorance to wisdom, and from suffering to enlightenment. Throughout the Gospels, Jesus is presented as a teacher, a healer, and a guide, someone who illuminates the path for others to follow. He represents the archetype of the seeker who, despite trials, remains focused on the higher truth. His journey from birth to crucifixion to resurrection mirrors the soul's journey through life, death, and spiritual awakening. In the esoteric traditions, the archetype of the seeker is a representation of the soul's potential to evolve. This archetype is not merely about following a specific religious path, but is about the universal quest for enlightenment. Every soul, regardless of its outward circumstances, has the capacity to awaken, just as Jesus did. Through his life and teachings, Jesus exemplifies the path of spiritual initiation, the process by which the soul must confront its lower self, endure suffering and hardship, and ultimately rise to a higher state of consciousness. His resurrection is a powerful symbol of the spiritual seeker who, through discipline and dedication, attains the highest spiritual realization. Section 5. Transformation through suffering, the alchemical process. At the heart of the crucifixion and resurrection is the alchemical process, the transformation of the base elements of the soul into pure spiritual gold. In alchemical traditions, there is a well-known saying, "As above, so below." This idea suggests that the processes occurring in the heavens are reflected in the human soul, and vice versa. The crucifixion can be seen as the first stage in this alchemical process, the breaking down of the soul's impurities. Just as in the alchemical tradition, where lead must be purified and transmuted into gold, so too must the soul undergo a period of purification. The suffering that Jesus endured represents the burning away of the dross, the ego, the attachments, and the lower desires that keep the soul tied to the material world. Once the ego has been crucified, the resurrection can take place. The soul, purified and free from the constraints of the material world, rises in a state of spiritual enlightenment. This is the alchemical great work, the transmutation of the soul from a base state to one of divine purity. In the esoteric view, suffering is not to be feared. Instead, it is seen as an essential step in the process of spiritual growth. It is through facing our trials and overcoming our challenges that we become capable of rising to higher states of consciousness. The alchemical process of death and resurrection is something that each spiritual seeker must go through, a process of refining the soul, of facing its deepest fears, and of transcending the lower nature. Section 6. Practical insights. How can we apply this concept to our own spiritual growth? Now that we have explored the deep symbolism behind Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, the question arises, how can we apply these profound teachings to our own spiritual journey? How can we understand the death and resurrection not just as a story, but as a living, breathing process that occurs within our own souls? The key to applying these teachings is to view every challenge, every setback, and every moment of suffering as an opportunity for spiritual growth. Much like Jesus, we are called to die to our lower selves, the parts of us that cling to the material world, the ego, and the fleeting pleasures of life. Through this death, which is not literal but symbolic, we begin to create space for a higher form of life, a life that is connected to the divine. The resurrection comes when we allow ourselves to emerge from the darkness of ignorance, attachment, and ego. It is through the transformative power of inner awakening that we rise into a new state of consciousness. This is not a one-time event, but a continual process. Every moment is an opportunity to die to the ego and to be reborn into the light of spiritual truth. So ask yourself, what parts of my life need to be crucified? What attachments am I holding on to that are preventing me from experiencing true spiritual freedom? And what new aspects of my consciousness are waiting to be resurrected? Conclusion. To conclude, the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus are not simply historical events, but powerful spiritual metaphors for our own journeys. They represent the transformative process of moving from the material to the spiritual, from the ego to the soul, from suffering to enlightenment. Through the story of Jesus' death and resurrection, we are reminded that true spiritual growth requires us to face the darkness within, to release our attachments to the material world, and to embrace a higher truth. Just as Jesus rose from the grave, so too can we rise from our own struggles, our own fears, and our own limitations into the light of divine understanding. Let this story be a reminder that no matter where we are in our spiritual journey, no matter how deep our suffering or how heavy our burdens, resurrection is always possible. The soul's path is one of continual rebirth, and it is through this process that we find our true essence. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of the profound spiritual truths behind the crucifixion and resurrection. May you find the courage to embrace your own transformation, knowing that with every ending comes a new beginning.